Thank you so much. So, as Cheryl mentioned, I've been sort of exploring architecture through exhibitions and other types of projects. I'm writing about architecture, etc. But this presentation really gave me a sort of nice opportunity to sort of dive into a period that's one of my favorite in architecture, which is the sort of high modernist legacy of architecture and how it traveled from European context to the United States. This kind of a small vignette that I opened with as the image for the exhibition, for the presentation, is part of a film called The Brutalist. Maybe you've seen it. It's from 2024 by Brady Corbett, that's the director. And it depicts the life of Laszlo Toth, who is a Jewish immigrant fleeing after the war from devastated Europe and into the United States. And they're trying to sort of make it, so to speak, in a very difficult, in very difficult circumstances and sort of rebuild his architectural dream. We'll open with a really short clip from this film. You can't hear it very well what they're speaking about. I'll narrate it a little bit later, so don't worry about it if it's not very loud.
These are yours, yes? All of them? Yes. I'm sorry. Have I upset you?
No. Not at all. Did not realize these images were still available, much less of any consequence. May I keep these?
Of course you may. They're very artistic.
So this short video really captures so much of the real stories of the time. And today I'd like to focus on three immigrants whose, stories kind of resonate with Laszlo Toth, the fictional character we've just seen. Hungarian architect and designer Marcel Breuer, Austrian architect Richard Neutra, and Prussian architect Erich Mendelsohn. All three were Jewish. All three immigrated eventually to the United States. Each traversed the turbulent times in very different ways. But I think first, before we kind of go into their individual stories, we really want to ask ourselves, how did modernism even get to the awareness of American patrons in the United States? Because this was not something that was common before, let's say, the Second World War. And one of the answers is this exhibition, Modern Architecture International Exhibition, that opened at the MoMA in 1932. This was the first, MoMA opened just a couple of years before that in 1929. And this was the first architectural exhibition in the new museum. And it was organized by these two people, Alfred Barr on the right, who was director of MoMA at the time, and the very interesting Philip Johnson on the left, who some of you may know if you're interested in architecture, one of the most famous American architects. But at this point in time, he's not even an architect. He's just a very affluent hair that's very interested in the arts and in architecture. And he's traveling with Barr for 2 years to Europe, seeking this new architecture all over, and then they bring it back and they decide to create this new expose of new architecture to the American public. And it's interesting because in that moment, in a very conscious way, they define some of the definitions that would follow modern architecture and its reception in the United States for decades to come. And I won't read what they're saying in the catalog, but basically what they're saying, modern architecture is new because it's rational. It's more rational than what we had before. And it is not about style. It's really about function. And as they say here, the facade reflects the plan. But even more important is this one. Beyond practical advantages, modern architecture is beautiful. And they really believe that, and they really pushed for it. And the exhibition itself was, in our contemporary eyes, it might seem a little bit modest, but it was hugely influential and amazingly important. So you've had all these modern architects showing the work, all of the famous names, if you know a little bit about modern architecture. Le Corbusier and Mendelssohn and everybody was there, and they were showing their works in plans, drawings, other types of drawings, photographs, as you see here, and models, architectural models. And so we went basically through these couple of rooms. It was not a big exhibition, especially not when compared to its sort of legacy. And you've seen all these projects that would later become sort of milestones of modernism. And one of the projects you've seen there was this one, which perhaps some of you would recognize to be the Bauhaus building designed by Walter Gropius. So this is where we'll start. At the Bauhaus, exactly 100 years ago, 1926. That's the Bauhaus building. That's the building a little bit after it was constructed in Dessau. It was not the first place where the Bauhaus school was working, but they moved to their new building, and the building was sort of epitomizing the spirit of the modernist ideal. And the Bauhaus is kind of interesting for our story, not only because Marcel Breuer, our first kind of protagonist, emerged from there, but because it really exported so much talent, and much of this talent went to the United States. So if we look at the famous picture on the roof of the Bauhaus, this is again exactly 100 years ago, 1926. We see many, many names that we might recognize from the history of art, modern art, and architecture. People like Wassily Kandinsky and Paul Klee and Feniger and Marcel Breuer and Gropius and Herbert Bayer, and Joseph Albers, of course, on the left. And of these people here, all of the ones marked in red found themselves in the United States just a couple of years later. The Bauhaus was very progressive, some would say radical in its politics. This is why the Nazis, when they came into power in 1933, really pushed for its closure, which happened a couple of years later. And all of these people basically dispersed to other places in Europe, some of them, and many of them to the United States for several reasons. If we look at the center, we see Walter Gropius. Gropius was the director of the Bauhaus and the architect of the building, and hugely influential. We'll talk about him in just a second. I think what's interesting with Breuer, each of our protagonists today is such an amazing kind of figure to follow in terms of historical narrative and the type of kind of architecture and how he handles architecture. But I think what is interesting about Breuer is that he started off as a designer. He was born in Hungary in 1902. And he immediately resists what Philip Johnson wrote in his MoMA exhibition. He says modern architecture is not a style, which is what Philip Johnson was saying. It's an attitude. And it's interesting because Breuer started off as a furniture designer. Maybe you know some of this furniture. It's among the most familiar pieces of modern furniture ever produced. He started experimenting with tubular steel furniture in the 20s during his work at the Bauhaus, and he created this chair. At first it had another name, but this is later known as the Vasily chair because he designed it for the Vasily Kandinsky house on the grounds of the Bauhaus school. This is Ilse Gropius, Walter Gropius's wife, wearing one of Oskar Schlemmer's, the modern theater genius, one of his masks, sitting on this chair. So a very famous, kind of iconic photo from the Bauhaus era. And in the 20s, Breuer begins to experiment with these kind of interiors. Which again might seem to us kind of, we know these kind of interiors. They seem kind of, familiar to us. But in the 20s, these were like super radical, a really radical way of conceiving how an interior should look like. The lightness of the furniture, the surfaces, the material, everything. He speaks of a new spirit for a new age, and this is the kind of agenda that these people are pushing at the time. Breuer is kind of Walter Gropius's best friend or partner, if you want, and they really collaborate on many things while in Germany in these years, the Bauhaus years. This is a very well-known exhibition of modern architecture in Stuttgart called the Weissenhof in 1927, and basically what all of the modern architects were doing they were building model houses. So this is a one-to-one, if you want, scale demonstration of what modern architecture could be in a sort of suburban, semi-urban environment. This is what it looked like. Really like building up the building again with everyone there, Mendelssohn and Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and all the big names of modern architecture. And this was the group.
Dan,
Yeah.
I'm just stopping you for a second. You said it's an exhibition?
This was this was like almost like an expo kind of exhibition. So these buildings were not built to be lived in. Nobody lived in these houses. These were just exhibition pavilions in a way, but shaped like modern architectural houses. So this is what we see here. Later, some of them were transformed into actual housing, like the things that we see at the back. So this, for example, is the demonstration house by Gropius, who created 2 houses for this exhibition. And inside, of course, he collaborated with Breuer. And again, we see this matching between a very radical exterior. Again, this is, completely abstract. This is, again, 1926. It's really early. Le Corbusier is really just experimenting with his first buildings in France and Switzerland at the time. So pretty early in the chronology of modern architecture. And we have this radical exterior matched with this pretty radical interior by their collaboration. And then Breuer gradually moves to construct his own kind of architectural pieces while still in Germany. And we see here the kind of lightness of his furniture, how it kind of translates into a very interesting and again, very radical at this point, architectural language. Really a favorite way, a sort of moment of architecture for me was this window that you can see how he's really pushing to translate the idea of lightness and the tubular, the metal, and all of these new materials into something that just is like a wall that opens almost completely and is very transparent. As we see these interiors, and of course they were also very good in photographing their. They had really good photographers as well, so they were really good in documenting and spreading their the documentation of the project. So this is where he's at in the beginning of the 30s, and then of course politics change, like all of the figures we'll speak about today, and he needs to move. But he moves in not the worst conditions, I would say, even though he's from Jewish descent, he's living Germany in quite a comfortable way. So he begins his immigration and he moves to the UK, where he immediately teams up because he's already recognized as this kind of huge talent. So he's commissioned to create new sets of furniture for innovative British company Isocon. So he's transitioning into the new technology of bent plywood, and he's doing this again quite well-known chair, and he's even doing a couple of buildings in his short time in Britain, which is just a number of years, and again pushing this kind of modernist idea. Again, in Britain, this is really new, and you don't see too many of these kind of buildings in the 30s. So these are kind of like strange creatures in the built landscape. And then again, he immigrates. So he moves from Britain and eventually gets to the United States. And if you recall, him and Gropius were very close allies. And Gropius immigrated a couple of years before that and got the position of running the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And he basically revolutionizes the school and begins sort of highly modernist tradition of architecture studies there. And he brings in all of this talent from the Bauhaus, including Breuer. And one of the first things, so Breuer comes in, he's in New York, and then he goes out to Massachusetts with Gropius, and he teaches at Harvard. And then they almost immediately begin to collaborate. They open a partnership. So they have like a shared agency, and they basically work on projects together. And this is one of the first projects, is the Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts. If you haven't been, it's open to the public, and it's really a great experience. So I highly recommend it if you get to the environment, to the area of Lincoln. And it's again this very pristine. And just imagine that in the rural areas of Lincoln, one of the, of course, very familiar battlegrounds of U.S. history, but at the same time, kind of quaint, kind of traditional in terms of architecture. And then you have this thing landing in, and this becomes the main Gropius residence. And again, this highly abstract kind of atmosphere of glass, steel, some brick, and a lot of white color. And you can see how kind of how articulate and nice this kind of abstract architecture is once you actually begin to experience it, with some very kind of well circulated photos of Ilse Gropius again without the mask, sitting on the veranda on the roof on those rare sunny days when it's warm enough in Lincoln, which doesn't I don't think it happens very often, but she could enjoy some sun there. Pretty soon after, Breuer, who was married in Germany but married to a fellow Bauhaus master and divorced, he remarries Connie Breuer. Connie Breuer is his assistant initially. Then they get married. She hails from a well-off Boston family, and together they begin like his new chapter in America. And it's kind of interesting because she's a little bit behind the scenes, but because she knows everybody in the West Coast, and she's really good in handling the business side of things, his company really becomes extremely successful, both in terms of exposure and the kind of works that he's being commissioned to do. So, pretty amazingly, a couple of years later, they're building their new family house in New Canaan in Connecticut, and it looks like that. And gradually, Breuer is experimenting with more and more materials that are local to the East Coast context, and is kind of shaping his modernist trajectory in very idiosyncratic ways, I would say. And another kind of interesting point in this career is what we see here, which is another exhibition by MoMA, in which they commissioned Breuer to build, again, as a sort of demonstration to the public, to build a one-to-one house next to MoMA, which is what we see here as part of an exhibition. So that's called the House in the Museum Garden exhibition. And we see this as a one-to-one house, basically just built there. And it's interesting because it, builds upon this post-war, or in a way leads towards this post-war idea of living that we'll see later developing in the suburbs in the United States for all sorts of reasons. And he's already there with this house. And at this point, he's kind of well established, really well known, and has a lot of commissions already. And it's interesting because this house is later being bought and rebuilt by John D. Rockefeller in New York. So we see the second incarnation of this house, which was dismantled and reassembled on the grounds of Rockefeller's mansion. And Breuer then builds another house for himself, which again is what we've seen here. And then he gets this amazing commission back in Paris. So back in Europe, he's now pretty well known in the United States. He gets this, it's a commission, it's a competition, basically invitation. Gropius is sitting in the jury, and they invite him to design the UNESCO headquarters, or the Secretariat building as part of the headquarters. So that's the end of the 50s, and he's working there with concrete genius Pierluigi Nervi, who's an Italian engineer, and together they sort of devise a new language for modernism. So here we see something a little bit different from the lightness that we've seen, I don't know, 8 or 10 years before. We see this kind of concrete expressionism, what would later be called brutalist architecture. We see how the sort of concrete meets the floor, how the texture of the concrete is really important, how we're not hiding anything. We really express the materials in very complete ways in this project. And interestingly enough, when he goes back to the United States, he's beginning to design projects that look like this. This is his St. John Abbey's church in Minnesota at the beginning of the 60s. really amazing piece of architecture that we won't go into too much detail, but just, to enjoy these images, how he's reconstructing the idea of a bell tower in front of the church, in the interior, which is, of course, again, this sort of concrete and light extravaganza. And he works with more and more churches, strangely enough. And he has another couple of them actually, but I'm showing just this one. And then he builds what is probably his most famous project, which is the Whitney Museum in New York. That's the mid-60s. And again, this is the sort of brutalist box that's become very hated by some, but also very famous because it's really become the sort of symbol of how you show art, especially American art in the 60s. And this really famous interior, again, it's all concrete and light and texture that became sort of hallmark. And many, many architects followed this, American architects really followed this kind of idea with these, eyes, really strange windows. And this is where he's at towards the end of his career. He passes away, I don't know, 10 years later, but he's become the sort of, he completed the transformation and became this really success story in a way. And now I want to go to the second protagonist, Richard Neutra. Here, Neutra speaks in a very different way from Breuer. He speaks about how the body, mind, and environment are connected through architecture, and how health, both mental and physical health, are part of what an architect should strive for through his projects. Neutra is an extremely, extremely complex figure. He immigrated well before World War II. He was Austrian. He was friends with Freud's son, Ernst Freud. He was his best friend. He was deeply affected and influenced by psychoanalysis. And as he moved to the United States, he found himself, after a stint with Frank Lloyd Wright, he moved to the West Coast. So he found himself in Los Angeles, which is basically where his career kind of as a modernist icon began. And this is the project that started it all in many ways. That's the Lovell House. Lovell was a typical Los Angeles 1920s figure. He was a Jewish guy from New York who immigrated to the West Coast after studying naturopathy and became this sort of health guru. And he practiced and preached so he had his own radio show and he had his own column in the newspaper, in the Los Angeles newspaper, and he preached for healthy lifestyle, what we would call today healthy lifestyle. And he was this really amazing figure, extremely successful as a businessman as well. And him and Neutra became somehow connected. And Neutra designed for him what became known as the Lovell Health House, which was one of his houses. He designed 4 houses at the same time in Los Angeles and its surrounding. And this is one of them. And the idea was that you could create a new type of architecture. Again, this is the 20s, extremely early in the development of modern architecture. And the idea was that you could develop this kind of environment that would promote health, both through supporting some of the practices like sunbathing, nude sunbathing for long hours, or dipping in a pool, or all sorts of, or fresh air, or certain types of diet, right? So this would become a demonstration house. And Neutra was extremely strong with this idea that a piece of architecture could become a demonstration for a new idea. And we'll see that later in other projects. Neutra started off with another Jewish immigrant who moved there a little bit before him. That's Rudolf Schindler. Their story and their relationship is subject for a completely different presentation, maybe one day. But they basically lived off the same. They shared the same office and the same house for a while until they split to their individual careers. Lovell, the doctor we mentioned before, hired both of them at the same time to design his houses, right? So Schindler is designing 2, Neutra is designing 2. This is one of them. And again, in the architecture, which was the first residential steel building in the United States, or at least that's the claim to fame, we see the really early emergence of this modern LA lifestyle that would become so familiar in decades to come. We see the pool, we see the sort of floating surfaces, we see the white architecture, the strip windows, the glass, the reflections, and the relationship between inside and outside. Again, all these themes that would be explored by Neutra in depth in later years. He built, a couple of hundreds of houses and other types of projects mostly in Southern California during his career. So again, the interior, the family life, and how they are sort of changed and could be improved, perhaps you'd say, or optimized by the right kind of architecture. This is what the Lovell House is trying to promote. And you can see it here. It's really this amazing. It's in Los Feliz. It's this really amazing. It was this really amazing piece of property. The house still exists and had been reconstructed or sort of retouched lately. So I think it's open and you can visit it today. You see how it was built. This sort of steel skeleton, extremely radical for its time, and it was sprayed with this sort of liquid concrete because the idea was that you could float these huge volumes above these open spaces. So you create this something that's almost like a theater facade. And Neutra, unlike some of the other architects that we tend to associate with modernist architecture, he was really about fast and cheap. One of his books is titled Fast and Cheap, and I really like it because I think it really captures his idea of how to use materials in a very simple way, not necessarily invest in very expensive and complicated ways of processing them, just to create this kind of vibe or an atmosphere that he was after. So this was, again, this part of the Lovell House, an amazing piece that really became a template for so many works that came later. And another experimental house that he did just a couple of years later was his own house. Shirel mentioned that I did a project at VDL. That's the house in Silver Lake. This is the first version of the house which burnt and got rebuilt. But this is where Neutra himself and his family lived for decades. And this is where he also had his first office. So in the ground floor, you have the office or the people working. On the upper floors, you'll have basically the parties because the kids were kind of pushed and put in the other pavilion from the other side of the garden. It was an experimental house because Neutra quite cunningly got a rich industrialist to sponsor it for him, with the idea that this could be again a demonstration for a new kind of architecture for Los Angeles and its environment. Again, you see, Neutra was always such a great model for his own building. So we see him here on the left. This is this house. At the time, Silver Lake Reservoir was closer to the house. Right now, there's a road in between. So it was really, the house was almost alone in the landscape because there were no neighbors. It was really close to the water. And Neutra's idea was really how you reflect the water through the glass, on the ceiling with the LA sun and the LA light, and it all becomes like this one experience. And so this was the experiment with this house. Again, the materials were new, the architecture was new, and this was the proximity it had at the time. If you looked from the side of the house towards the reservoir, that's still here today, of course, but the view is slightly different. And Neutra was built himself. So this was a 3-floor house. We'll see the plans in a second. And Neutra built himself a penthouse floor where he could rest and sort of visualize his next project. This was also very important in the psychology of his project. Of his projects. Next project I'll really go through briefly was the really well-known Edgar Kaufman house in Palm Springs that he built in the 40s. An amazing big house. This is not a small, cheap, fast house. This is actually the development, the evolution of the California house into something that's much more affluent and in many ways kind of the domain of richer people. Edgar Kaufman was the patron that basically built Falling Water with Frank Lloyd Wright, and this was his desert house in Palm Springs. At the time, in a kind of empty environment. Of course, it was filled later. But again, we see this sort of exponential growth and evolution of the same ideas, the floating planes, the pool, the sort of leisure lifestyle combination that becomes again the template. And if we see VDL2, which is again the house that Neutra builds after the first one that we've seen before is burnt. We see again this sort of 3 floors. It's the same house, but bigger and better. It's built in the beginning of the 60s. If you can read plans, you see that this is the ground floor, and we have the office, which is A, and then there are stairs. And in the second floor, again, we have the living quarters on the right, and on the left, we have the living room where they would host many really well-known intellectuals of the time and artists, and they had their bohemian salon. And again, he kept the penthouse, which is one of the most amazing spaces. If we look at it, this is Neutra on the roof, again, modeling for his architecture. We see this really small penthouse floor that you could still visit today, the reflecting pool. Again, this idea that light travels in complex ways and kind of reshapes architecture, and how your experience is part of it. And it's an amazingly nice house, and I would really advise you to visit it if you get a chance, because the way reflection works there really becomes this sort of immaterial experience. And towards the end of his life, basically Neutra's legacy shaped up as something like this. This is a fashion photographer photo of the house we've seen before, recast now as this sort of social space. So this is towards the beginning of the 70s already, which is where Neutra passed away. But he was always immersed. I think he got himself really immersed. He immigrated, he got to LA, and he got himself sort of into the waters, a little bit like in this picture here where he swims in one of his villas. And third person whose story is even more complicated, and I'd like to talk about today, is Erich Mendelsohn. Mendelssohn's story is much more tragic in so many ways. He left Germany in the 30s, and we'll speak about that in a second. But before that, I'll say that Mendelssohn, of the 3, he was the biggest star while in Germany. He was born a little bit before the others in 1887. By the 20s, he was really well-known figure in architectural modernism. He started off as one of the heads of the expressionist movement in architecture, in German architecture. He was well established. He was extremely smart in the way he handled his business, and he was extremely talented as well. So here we see the sketches, some of the sketches for the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, one of his early works of expressionist architecture that he got commissioned pretty early on in his career and really got him super famous. This was really radical for the time. It's built just after the First World War, essentially. And it was built for Albert Einstein, which we see here during construction in the building. And it became an observatory as part of a university later. But interestingly enough, Mendelssohn, like some of the others in the modernist movement, is fascinated by the United States. So he goes to America, as he calls it, and he travels and he photographs and he writes about it. And he's inspired by what he sees there. For instance, these grain silos that he sees in New York. So he goes up the East Coast and he sees these structures, and it immediately kind of combines with these expressionist ideas to his next phase, architectural phase, which is what we see here. His set of commissions for the Schocken family. The Schocken family are, today we know them, or some of us know them from Haaretz newspaper in Israel, but they're a well-established German family who are made their fortune from commerce, essentially, and they held a chain of department stores in the 20s and 30s, and Mendelssohn was their house architect, basically. So we see here how some of his ideas about expressionist architecture are combined with what he sees in the United States, and he begins to sort of sketch these kind of, fluent types of architecture, and Schocken gives him the opportunity to get them built. So we see Schocken really investing in this idea of new radical architecture in the 20s and 30s. This is some of his departments, the Kaufhauses, as they're called in Germany. And just if you observe this photo, it's really simple to see the architecture on the right and Mendelssohn's architecture. Just see how radically different it is for the time it's being built. So new, so, different in so many ways. Mendelssohn becomes the envy of his peers when he pretty early on becomes very successful, and he builds his own house next to Berlin, which is what we see here. So Mendelssohn has a really nice piece of property, and he gets to build his own house according to his own ideals. This is his villa. And it all goes very well, of course, until the Nazis seize power. And unlike the others who, Neutra, of course, left years before, and Breuer managed to live in quite favorable conditions. Mendelssohn, because he was, pretty famous, and he was associated with Schocken, who was also Jewish, so he's immediately being sort of expelled from the architecture league, which means he cannot build in Germany. This is happening right after the Nazis seized power. His property is being seized. He's left with basically nothing. His office is being seized, and he decides to leave in an instant. His wife deposits her cello in Swiss depository. So she was a gifted cello player, and he and her basically lives with their daughter, overnight. And the famous story about Mendelssohn is that he gets to Amsterdam, and he lands, and he gets off the train. He sees somebody he knows, and this person who's also an architect is really surprised to see him, and he says, "What are you doing here, Erich?" And he's saying, he's taking out a pencil, like a 6B pencil, which is one of the softer pencils, and he says, "I've just moved my office to Amsterdam." And this is basically what happens. So he has to start anew under very difficult circumstances. And what he's doing, he's again opening, because he still has this sort of international fame, of course, and he's opening two agencies at the same time, as strange as it may sound. The first in England, next to London, with a partner, and the second in Palestine, which is a story you may know. He opened his office in Jerusalem, next to the windmill in Jerusalem, in Rehavia, if you know this curious building. And in England, he designs the Delaware Pavilion, which becomes very famous. Again, this Mendelssohnian, you see this kind of, round shapes, extremely modern, almost like a ship kind of architecture. This is a pavilion commissioned in Sussex for basically expositions and public events, etc. And we see Mendelssohn was extremely gifted, not only in designing the outside of the building, but also in determining all of the sort of interior kind of feel and vibe of it. And at the same time, he's doing these kind of architectures in Jerusalem. So he's, on the one hand, is one of the symbols of modern architecture, but on the other, he's extremely sensitive to context. So when he gets to Jerusalem, he gets commissioned this project and another one by Schocken. Schocken also moves in these years, of course, to Palestine, and he builds this project, which is the Schocken Library. If any of you get to Jerusalem anytime soon, I highly recommend it. It still exists 90 years later, and it's the best interior you could find in Israel by far. Because Mendelssohn, of course, designed both the exterior and the interior. Inside, you would have, again, this is a longer story, but Schocken built his intellectual salon in Jerusalem, and you would have all these meetings happening there with all the giants, the sort of intellectual giants of the time. And Mendelssohn also built this house for Chaim Weizmann, whom he knows from London. And this is in Rehovot, in the Weizmann Institute, which some of you may know. Again, an amazing project that is still there. And you could see it, this idea of new type of living in a really different climate, and he really responds to that. He's designing a couple of more projects that I won't go deep into during his really short time in Palestine. But then the Nazis advanced in the North African front, and Mendelssohn really fears for his life. And he thinks, in 1940, 41, it seems like there are good chances that they will reach this part of the world. And he and his family decides to leave basically again, and they move to the United States. And they move to the United States in really impoverished conditions because during his time in Palestine, he was not really commercially successful, even though he's built some stuff. And they moved there because the prospect seemed to be okay. As he gets to the United States, there's a small retrospective exhibition, again at the MoMA, of his work. So it's a retrospective of Mendelssohn just as he lands. And this seems very optimistic. But then what's happening is that for 4 years after he lands, he cannot build because he's considered a German or an alien citizen, right, of an enemy state. So he cannot really build in the United States. He's advising the Department of Defense, the military, basically on some war stuff, but he cannot build new projects. So his career really gets stuck in so many ways, even though he was the biggest star of the three that we're talking about today. But something interesting still happens, even though these 7 years that he spends in the United States are difficult, and then he passes away. But in these 7 years, he, is getting reconnected in a way to his heritage, and he gets into a conversation with all sorts of communities, Jewish communities, who are interested in sort of rebuilding the idea of a temple as part of basically a cultural complex, a Jewish cultural complex, because after the World War II, what we have is more, affluent Jewish communities going out to the suburbs and trying to sort of build a new lifestyle in many ways. And this architecture for the new cultural complex, where the spiritual side is one component of, becomes quite an interesting program. So they approach Mendelssohn after they see his exhibition from the MoMA travel to the Midwest. And this is how he gets to build this first really interesting complex in St. Louis. So the complex is something like that. We see the temple on the top, which is the sort of curved roof building. But interestingly, not less interesting is that the idea that we have a complete set of buildings that becomes the house for this specific Jewish community. We can see it here in the plan, how this is an interesting thing that brings together all sorts of functions from the life of Jewish communities, in the early 50s in this case. And also the interior is quite expressive and interesting because it's really trying to redefine what synagogue architecture is in the United States at this moment in time. And towards the end of his life, he's doing a couple of other commissions like this one, which again is this kind of amazing dome, which is the dome for the synagogue, and this kind of crazy, I would say, crazy interiors that really envelopes you. And I think he's really trying to, redefine spiritually and materially what it means to be Jewish after the World War II and in the context of the United States. But again, this is a difficult journey, not an easy one. And he doesn't become extremely successful in the United States. Gradually, it becomes more and more appreciated. He's worked in this part. And I think if we go back, just to wrap it up for a moment, if you go back to the film, to The Brutalist, it's an interesting film to watch because, again, it reflects these stories that we've just went through. But there's a moment in the film in which, finally the architect Laszlo Toth is becoming successful, and he's getting this commission, which is this huge building, a Brutalist building. And if we look at the building, how they built it, the image of the building in the set, we really see Mendelssohn, right? You see the dome and how the light is filtered from above. And in the architecture, this is the set designer building the model that in which this part was shot. And we really see the Breuer church in so many ways, right? So the real architecture, the real kind of journey of architecture from Europe into these contexts that we've seen before kind of reflects in the film in I think interesting ways. And if we circle back to the image with which we open this interior, we see all these architects work in a way. We see Mendelssohn's rounded windows. We see Neutra's game of surfaces. We also see Breuer's tubular furniture in the middle. And in the film, Laszlo Toth ends up building these sort of massive American projects and then immigrating again. So in a way, it's a tragic story. And the three lives that we, that briefly sketched here remind us that while we tend to think of immigration as a collective wave, something that happens to large groups of people, the fate and trajectory of each person are shaped by individual circumstances. So as we've seen, talent is not always enough. It is timing, it is personality, and even sheer luck that dictate the course of life, and with it, the course of modern architecture. Thank you.
Wow, Dan, thank you so much. I've just removed Spotlight in favor of speaker view. So for those of you, you can choose speaker view. I'll do the same, and I'm going to jump right into questions. One moment. So I'll start with the lighter, quicker ones. For those of you who are raising your hand, if it's because you can't find the chat, I'll get to you the moment I can, but we're not going to unmute anyone, and I'll go quickly into the questions. So first is a really short one, and it's about the LA houses designed by Neutra, and if he took into account anything regarding the earthquakes, if it was part of kind of the considerations, or was it something that then wasn't really thought of?
Well, gradually. I mean, at the beginning, Neutra begins to build in LA in the 20s, as we've seen. In the beginning, this is not a huge concern, or at least it's not scientifically coded into the architecture. I think gradually, as we move into his 50s and 60s project, there are arguments that some of these houses could withstand earthquakes better than traditional wooden architecture, for instance. But I wouldn't say this is, the main kind of driver of his design.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about the synagogue. You showed us Bnei Emunah, and if you're aware of its latest renovation and the way they split the building, and if we have here architects in the crowd, one from St. Louis. Do you have any thoughts about the renovation that was done there? And if you can say a few words about it, if you're familiar with it. If not,
I would rather not go too much into detail of that because I didn't visit it after, after the renovation. So I've seen it, I've seen the plans, I know what the architects did or the designers, but perhaps it's not the best to talk about whether it's compromising or improving the architectural ideas of Mendelssohn.
Okay, another question. I'm starting with the small ones, and then we'll get to the larger
to the heavy ones.
Yes. Do any of Mendelssohn's German buildings still stand?
Of course. Some of the Kaufhauses miraculously survived the war, so they're still there in Stuttgart, and there are a couple of others. Some of his private residences are there, and of course the ones, well, not in Germany, but of course in Israel, you could see them, and some projects that were, part of the Germany, but now are in Poland, for instance. So you have quite a few of his buildings still intact.
Another question, which will be a segue to more, and this is a speculative one. Do you think that if Mendelssohn was successful in the US, he would have still be building synagogues, or was that a kind of effect of his career kind of going where it did?
I think it's a very interesting question, and some people did write about this, right? I mean, researchers who are kind of big on Mendelssohn, and if you ask me, I would say that these two things are connected. I think he became more interested and perhaps shaped by the experiences of immigration. Again, this was a difficult course of, both in Palestine and in the United States. So he basically, he was the superstar. He was the superstar of architecture in the 20s and the early 30s. And then he spent, 15 or almost 20 years of his life in very different circumstances. So I think that if you see his letters, there's a lot of melancholy, but there's also, I think, renewed interest in the spiritual aspects of things. I wouldn't say he became, this sort of ultra-Orthodox Jew all of a sudden. This didn't happen, but I think he definitely developed a perspective that got him interested in these kind of projects. And because the commissions came in through the Jewish communities, I think this became an interesting avenue to explore. This was by no means just a sort of, I don't have any work, so this is what I'm going to do. You see that he invents and reinvents the typology of these buildings.
Thank you. A few more questions around the Jewish aspect. And do we know, or do you think the Jewish history or heritage of these architects, all three, affected the way they were building? And if so, did they speak about it? Like how does that factor into what they were doing?
I think it's interesting because of the three, Mendelssohn in a way was the most Jewish, in the way he kind of found his career developing and his personal views. And we also have to remember that they came from slightly different backgrounds as well, different countries, different cultural backgrounds, even though they shared the German as a sort of language. I would say that Breuer was probably the one who was, most easygoing about, not caring at all about the fact that he was Jewish. I think he was a very interesting personality, and he kind of navigated his way pretty smoothly. He built churches as easily as he would build any other thing. It's not that I think that, a Christian cannot build a synagogue, etc. But I think he was extremely proficient in navigating his career, and he was, well liked by everybody. And I don't think he mentions his Judaism, very often, or almost not at all. I don't think there was a huge concern, not in the people he married, not in the way he ran his family life, not in a way he expressed himself with his colleagues, and definitely not with the public. So he's the most kind of, elusive. I think Neutra is an interesting story. He was not very explicit about his Jewish tradition, but at the same time, there are some things in his architecture that I would say are kind of interesting if you consider that. So it's again, it's not an Orthodox Jewish tradition. It's this sort of intellectual Jewish tradition of Europe in the turn of the century. This is the kind of Judaism that I think he carries a little bit further through his conversations with the young Freud, his sort of implementation, which we didn't talk about at all. I'm sorry, this is the next one. He's really attempting to sort of integrate psychology into his work, into his architecture. I think there's something there. The way he handled his clients.
To be specific, and for instance, say where you see it in his architecture.
I mean, first of all, in his process, he would interview you if you were his client. He would interview you for hours, as if you're on a psychiatrist or psychologist couch, basically. And he has some really famous maxims where he says, I'm quoting from memory, but if you wanna ruin marriage life, just design the kitchen a little bit too small, 2 inches too small. Like these kind of things. He really believed that architecture reflects, but also can influence the psychology of architecture of people who inhabit it. And his buildings, I lived in this VDL house that we mentioned as part of this project, and it really works. I mean, he was a master of combining these two things. And I think there's something, again, without going into being too schematic about it, but I think there's something very very related to his Jewish background in this kind of thing. And Mendelssohn, we mentioned, I think he was much more connected towards the end to his kind of history, both personal and sort of collective history of the Jewish people.
Thanks. I'm going to slip in one more question before we close. There was a question if Mendelssohn was involved in Tel Aviv's White City Bauhaus designs, or how much of the new building.
He was not involved directly in I mean, he was very influential on some of the architects that built it eventually, but he was not directly involved. He had projects in some unbuilt projects in Haifa and in Jerusalem. He built the Hadassah hospital that we've seen, or partly designed it, and he partly designed the Rambam hospital in Haifa. But in Tel Aviv, these were just, some things that got trickled down later into architecture, but he didn't have a major architectural commission in Tel Aviv.
Okay, thank you, Dan. My chat is just full with compliments and stories of people
I'm sure.
that know the buildings, that donated some chairs.
Nice.
Yeah, and a lot of architectural questions about, like, I'm just seeing one about the new Geffen building at Lakma. We don't have time to go into all your thoughts, but it's pretty clear that we want you back. And thank you for this really fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated. I was happy to be here.